ワンオンワンテック始まります。今日のテーマは AI は誰のものかです。OpenAI とか Anthropic とか Google など、最先端の AI モデルはごく一握りの企業が開発しています。でしかも我々の生活とか仕事だけじゃなくて、金融システムだとかサイバーセキュリティ、それから防衛の領域まで入り始めています。そんな中で国や政府というのが置き去りにされたのではないか。ビッグテックがもはや国家を超える権力を持って今や民主主義も操る存在になっているんじゃないか。そんな問題意識を詰め込んだ欧米で話題の本が今年5月日本でも発売されました。こちらです。テクノクーデター、民主主義崩壊とシリコンバレーの野望という本なんですけども、今日はこの著者の方をお呼びして強力な AI が社会をどう変えてしまうのか、世界そして日本はどう向き合うべきなのかお伺いしていきます。今日のトピックは3つです。クロードミトスに世界はどう向き合うべきなのか、そしてビッグテックは自由放任でいいのか、そして最後に EU の権威が考える日本への処方箋、この3つでお送りします。それではゲストをご紹介します。テクノロジー政策に詳しい元欧州議会議員で、現在はスタンフォード大学のサイバー政策センターで国際政策ディレクターを務めるマリエッチェ・スハーケさんです。So we have Ms. Marietje Schaake on the show. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So before we move on to the main topics, could you quickly tell us why you wrote this book and what the tech coup means?
Yeah, so I've served in the European Parliament for 10 years, between 2009 and 2019, and that was a time of a lot of change in how people saw technology, from embracing it as an incredible opportunity, also for democratization, to the enormous growth of these tech companies and a growing focus on risks. Think about disinformation through social media, think about cybersecurity threats or things like that. And I noticed that the focus on what the impact of technology on our society is tended to be fragmented. So some people might look at defense and cyber war, some people might look at the economic benefits, some people might look at the impact on children. But the more I thought about it, and then after I stepped down from the European Parliament, I moved to Stanford. So I was teaching people who would end up working in the big AI labs. I was among people who have contributed to the knowledge and expertise, the actual networks and big models of AI. And I came to the conclusion that we need to see technology much more through a lens of power in order to understand what the impact is on our society and our democracy. And so I thought, let me try to make that case in a book, because in my work also from the academic side, I engage a lot with policymakers, and I think a lot of them are struggling to understand what is their best contribution for serving the people, to dealing with tech. And I think looking at technology through a lens of power is incredibly important, and so that's what I did.
So what the specifically tech coup means?
Yes. So I came to the conclusion that a lot of power, decision-making agency roles that used to be the exclusive domain of states, think about developing infrastructure, think about access to information and intelligence, think about engaging in offensive activities, cross-border conflict, used to be the exclusive domain of states, usually with checks and balances, a high threshold, for example, to engage in conflict. A parliament would have to improve. But now these are tasks that increasingly private companies are making decisions about, but without such a mandate, without such checks and balances, without accountability. And I see this as a threat to democracy. Now, I'm critical of what the companies think they can do themselves, so their lack of appreciation for the common good. But I'm also critical of leaders, political leaders, who've allowed this situation to emerge, where a lot is at stake, but we're allowing companies, now look at the big AI companies, to take huge gambles with impact on society.
Right. So how do you think it's important for average people, general people in the world?
Well, so I see technology as a layer touching every aspect of our lives. The way we raise our children, the way we access knowledge and education, our healthcare, our security, our civil liberties. And so if we consider tech such an important layer of everything, then we have to ask ourselves who governs this layer. And private companies, by and large, govern this layer of our lives. And they are in the world to make profit, to grow, to be faster and better than their competitors. And we shouldn't be surprised about that. But companies are not in the best position to make trade-offs between, I don't know, privacy and economic benefits, or the broader societal impact, national security. And so I think by outsourcing so many aspects of our lives to companies that are not only just profit hungry, but that are also far removed from the context, let's take here in Japan, in which people live, in which this impact is felt, it's just not good for the public interest. It's not good for democracy. And I think Japanese people know this. People in Europe are very much aware of this, that democracy was hard fought. We've had to wrestle in the past against authoritarianism. Democracy is the best way to make sure that there is a balance in society, that there's representation in society. And I don't think we should take it lightly. I think we should make sure that democracy actually survives this digital disruption. And I trust that the survival of democracy ultimately benefits all people.
Right. Okay. Let me move on to the first part, which is about Claude Mythos. I think in your book you argue that the many countries around the world have become dependent on private companies for critical technology, as you said right now. In April, Anthropic announced Claude Mythos, which has dramatically increased cybersecurity risks for many countries and critical infrastructures, and so governments are struggling to respond to that. So I want to ask you first, how do you assess the power and impact of Claude Mythos?
Well, the way it allows for the discovery of thus far unknown vulnerabilities in software means it's very impactful, both if attackers get their hands on it, but also for making the software systems more robust. So it clearly has two sides, because understanding where these vulnerabilities are also allows companies that produce the software to create patches and updates to make their systems more secure. But the fact that it's a company that holds such a powerful model with global implications, and that governments are basically not a part of this discussion, only at the discretion of the company, or through the power that the US government has to obtain access. The NSA, National Security Agency, now has access to this model, which intelligence services also use for espionage. They use vulnerabilities in software for espionage. So I think it's a really good example of what happens when we don't have a regulatory framework, when we don't have global agreement on how to handle the most consequential AI models. And so, I believe that we need global agreement to make sure that we have a process for dealing with these kinds of risky models. It's Mythos today, it could be something else tomorrow. And, I hope that we can bring back the focus to the need of international agreements, because since the second Trump administration, and since the US has really forcefully stepped away from a lot of international agreements, from respecting the United Nations and wanting to work together, they are choosing a zero-sum view of the world instead. We see that this has real-world consequences, that international cooperation is not abstract, it's concrete. And I think that this Mythos example reminds us of the value of having better coordination. And I hope that this is where the world can move to. If not collectively, then at least with a smaller group of countries that can agree among themselves.
So how do you think that they can make those international agreement or cooperation happen?
So I think it's risky in and of itself to have the latest models released almost instantly. So in this case, Anthropic chose whom it wanted to share the model with, at least initially. But of course, then others gained access also in unofficial ways.
Only in Anthropic's interest, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Anthropic has, and I think we should be happy with that aspect, has put safety first since its creation. it really cares about AI safety, and I think more people should care about AI safety. But I do not believe that any company is in the best position to assess the security or the appropriateness or the compliance of its own models. In other words, I think there's a lot of value in having independent assessments and assessments from a public interest point of view. So I don't believe, to put it simply, in the butcher testing the quality of their own meat. I think you need a separation. And so what we see in the case of Mythos is that it's Anthropic that develops it, but that also decides when to release it and to whom to release it, while the consequences are global. And while public authorities are not really a part of the equation. And I think that it's a reminder for public authorities also to assert themselves in the public interest, that it's important that we have a better understanding of AI, so more access to information about AI in the public interest, and that we try to do a risk assessment before the release of these models and not sort of scramble afterwards, because this whole response to Mythos has been a scrambling. You know, banks concerned, governments concerned, hastily trying to get in touch with a company far on the other side of the world. Now, some have managed. I learned that Japanese banks have gained access to Mythos, and I'm sure it will help them. But not everybody is in that situation, and the cybersecurity risks are potentially enormous when this gets into the wrong hands and gets exploited for intelligence gathering or attacks.
So, what do you think governments should learn from this, the Mythos launch, those events around Mythos?
Well, I think in general they should be in a position to better represent the broader interests of society and citizens, and not give away so much power to corporations that have their own agenda. And we shouldn't be surprised that they have their own agenda. You know, a company wants to satisfy investors, wants to win against competitors, but it doesn't have the well-being of all of society in mind. That's the role of government. And I think government should take that role. I focus on democratic governments and the survival of the rule of law and democracy. And I think for that survival, it is critical that we have a much better grip on the part of democratic governments on what technology is in our society. I see huge opportunities, but I don't think those opportunities will benefit the broader, people. If those trade-offs are not made in the general interest, if the trade-offs are only made in the corporate interest, if we allow them not only monopolies in the market, but also monopolies on information, about what they make, about their models, about when they want to release them, when they want to release information about them, then we just give too much power away to private companies.
Okay. And Anthropic also came into conflict with Department Defense in the US just a few months ago over the military use of Claude. The company was designated as a supply chain risk after. How do you think the Trump administration is doing their job around the control of technology?
Well, it's interesting because there's a bit of a myth that the Trump administration is not regulating tech, but it is regulating tech. It's just regulating in a very unconventional way. It's regulating very directly, often through the executive, so through the president, executive orders, interventions like the confrontation between the Department of War and Anthropic. And what we see is that a lot of the agenda is quite personal. So, for example, if the president doesn't like someone who criticized him before, who works at a company, he will then remove the security clearances from people in that company. Or when he forced the sell-off of the American part of TikTok, it ended up in the hands of one of his political supporters. So we see unprecedented interventions in companies for political reasons. And I see the standoff between Anthropic and the Department of War in that same context. Later, some of those designations have been reversed by a legal ruling. And now, of course, the US government is keen to engage with Anthropic over Mythos. So it's really a lot of flip-flopping. But what we see is that actually the impact of US policy, both through the law, think about the Cloud Act, which gives authorities, justice, intelligence, law enforcement access to data on American cloud servers wherever in the world it may exist. And the FISA law does the same for the intelligence part. So we have the legal part, but we also have the political part, where an executive order of the president can really stir things in a different direction. And we've already seen sanctions being adopted, for example, towards the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who lost access to payment services, lost access to digital services, just because the US president adopted sanctions. And so I think this volatility has ripple effects around the world, because actually it gives a lot of power to the US president, who sees AI, if you read the AI action plan, the official US AI strategy, as an instrument for imperialism. They want absolute dominance of American AI. They see the world in zero-sum terms. So basically the idea is to push the adoption of US AI across the world, and then to get a greater grip on people and countries around the world through this dependency. A dependency that can be weaponized, that can be a tool for pressure. And I think it makes all of us quite vulnerable. It's an undesirable situation to be in such a dependency, and I think that dependency exists in Japan, it also exists in Europe, and we can learn a lot of lessons from that.
Yeah, I think the power dynamics between big tech and the government changed after the Trump came into the office for the second time. In your book, you basically argue the government needs to regain control over technology. So when you say government control over technology, what does it specifically mean?
Well, I speak about the need to have more guardrails and to have more regulation in the interest of safeguarding the rule of law and democracy. So my interest is always to protect the self-determination, the fundamental rights, and the well-being of people, citizens. And I think it's a mistake to think about regulation as being, all the power in the hands of government against the companies. I don't think it works that way. It's often about putting checks on both. So let me give you an example. The European General Data Protection Regulation is a privacy law, and it binds the government's behavior in how it is allowed to handle data. It also binds public organizations, let's think about a library or a university, and it binds companies, including tech companies. And so I think the idea of having guardrails is not an exclusive, restriction on companies. It should be applying to governments as well. So, for example, regulation could stipulate how governments and the military would be allowed to use AI. What kind of mandate would they need? What kind of oversight would they need? Where do chains of responsibility lie? So, in other words, let's say that there is an international operation happening with the help of an AI company and something goes wrong. Who is responsible? How do we know? Et cetera, et cetera. So it's really about going back to those very core principles of what the rule of law is, having a mandate from the people, having independent oversight, having fairness, across the spectrum, and then applying those principles in the context of tech and AI. And that last part we have sort of failed to do. So, for example, where non-discrimination is a principle in many democratic constitutions, we see that AI discriminates. And there's really no debate about whether discrimination should be legal. Most people agree it should not be. Yet it happens. And so how come we cannot, extend our enforcement processes and our application of the law into these new contexts? I think it's a wide challenge. But a lot of answers lie in an understanding of what the law is for, what fundamental principles are for, and now the task is to implement those in a new way.
So when I think about the Anthropic, the US government case, I was wondering what the proper relationship between AI labs and the government should look like. So what do you think?
Well, I'm not putting up the U.S. model as an ideal one. I think both the government and the companies are behaving in very self-interested ways, and people ultimately pay the price. In the case of Anthropic, what's interesting is that the CEO has actually said that he agrees for 98 to 99% with Trump for the policies that the administration has. So the conflict is only about two specific issues.
Right.
One, fully automatic weapon systems that the company argues AI is not ready for. So I don't think they're principally against, they just don't think that the AI is good enough yet. But also the mass surveillance of American citizens.
Right.
And in this case, it was actually a part of the contract that Anthropic signed that they didn't want these two uses. So it's really also a matter of contract law and how powerful that is. But I think it should be assumed that if you, as a company, provide products or services to a government, that the government will use it whichever way it sees fit. And that this is how the US military, but also other governments would act. And so I think it's important that, for example, parliaments, civil society groups, but also other companies raise their voices to make sure that there are predictable and fair processes for this. Because this kind of ad hoc manner of fighting and then having a sort of punishment, a very strict punishment, this supply chain risk is an unprecedented kind of designation from the US government to a US company. It's not a desirable situation. It's chaotic. It could be, quite random how these effects play out. It's really not very predictable, and it risks being politicized much more than being sort of equal treatment. And so I would say that in an ideal situation, we have a predictable process that both puts guardrails around the use of AI by governments, but also the role that companies play in order to act within that set of boundaries. And I would love to see that process being a sort of normal legislative process, meaning that people's representatives write a draft law and that the normal legislative procedure takes its course instead of this top-down ad hoc set of measures. And what we see in the US now is, while on a federal level this is not happening because the Republican Party is not interested. In fact, President Trump has tried to prevent states from adopting laws, but he has failed. And states are, in the United States, moving ahead with developing these guardrails because people want to see their concerns and the risks that they see of the use of AI addressed. And these are wide concerns, wide risks that they are addressing. And so we will see more fragmentation in the United States. It's not that we will not see action, it will just look different than what we've seen in the US before.
It was interesting that you compare the governance of critical technology to safety and environmental and traffic regulation for cars. So you're saying you need regulations, especially if you want to make technology widely available. So as AI becomes more powerful, as we see with Mythos, so what kind of regulations and what guardrail do we need, or do we need similar regulations for AI, such as safety standards or third-party audits or reporting requirements to governments and such thing?
Yes, so I think we need all of that. I think, first of all, that we need a little bit of time between the development of a model and placing it onto the market, and to use that time to understand the models better from a public interest point of view. So, for example, we've recently been quite shocked by the Grok model that allowed for the virtual undressing of women and even children against their will, which speaks for itself, but just want to make sure that that's clear. And I don't think that this model would have been approved had it been tested before, and so it should have been prevented from being released. And a model with the capabilities of Mythos should probably also be understood first from a public interest point of view. So I am in favor of having more time to assess powerful models, and indeed to have independent audits for safety, but also for other concerns like non-discrimination, for example, or broader societal challenges. And the EU AI Act addresses some of these criteria and processes. But again, it would be much better if we could find a broad international coalition which would form a greater critical mass, would represent more people. Because, of course, these are global companies. The Mythos example reminds us that the decisions that are made in one part of the world sort of ripple through the rest of the world. And so having global agreements between at least like-minded nations would be a huge help to be a counterweight to whichever politics are now dominant in the United States.
Right. Okay. Let me move on to the second part. big tech and the government. So you argue that technology companies are no longer just companies, but powerful actors shaping public spaces and state functions. So from your perspective, when and how did big tech move from like just being companies to something closer to governing powers?
Well, it happened over a period of maybe 10, 15 years, where, I think we were all sort of mesmerized by what we saw on the surface. So, for example, search engines or email services, location services, now chatbots. But we have not understood the dynamics behind it and the consequences from a lens of power of what happens when big tech companies develop critical infrastructure like satellite constellations, like undersea data cables that are also of hugely geopolitically important nature, or what happens when companies know everything about us but we know very little about them. What happens when intransparent algorithms impact our young people's mental health, but also the curation of our public debate, so everything that we fear or that we want to buy. The impact is societal. It's not just a commercial product.
Right.
And I think that that's something that has taken too long for governments to understand and to act upon. They've placed a lot of trust in market forces. This is really the American model, for decades, to have little intervention and laissez-faire economic policies. And this has been applied to AI and tech as well. But we have to conclude now that it's gone too far. And, it may be helpful for people who don't know me, but I come from a centrist liberal political tradition. So, in principle, my inclination is not to say, let the government solve it. I'm actually a big believer in not too much regulation, but to have regulation when it's necessary. And if we look at the excesses of tech development, tech's use, the power of companies now, that there are many excesses that need to be curbed. We haven't touched upon the impact on the environment, but it's really significant, the use of electricity, of water, of land. And a lot of what is being asked of us now as societies to sacrifice, the big gamble that is being made with the AI companies, and consequences could be for the global economy if the AI bubble bursts, impact on the environment, impact on civil liberties, impact on science. There's a notion of information poisoning, which means that there could be, politically informed information fed into the system in order to get, favorable views out of chatbots about countries or people. But we're now also seeing that because people are beginning to use chatbots for scientific papers, that there are hallucinations feeding into science, and this science is informing the way doctors treat patients, the way medicine is developed, and so we're getting this erosion of even the standards of academic research, the standards of pursuing the truth, and I think that this is really bad also for our own critical minds, and this has democratic consequences too, because if people become used to outsourcing decision making, they just think, oh, the chatbot can answer this, the chatbot can answer that, then maybe they will also become more willing to just follow, whatever process someone sets out, instead of thinking, I'm a critical citizen, I need objective information, I need to make my own decisions, and I also want to say no to certain things that, others are deciding about me. And I really worry about our sort of critical thought muscle and what that means, not just today, but let's say in the next 5 years or 10 years.
Right. So you're basically saying the AI the strong AI models should not be developed by only one company, but it should be involving like multi layers of stakeholders and do it in the public interest.
So I think we need a society-wide definition of what AI success looks like. And then to look at the latest models, especially when there are big consequences attached, with an eye to making sure that society benefits. And so that means decreasing national security risk, decreasing environmental footprint, decreasing discrimination, anticipating job displacement, social unrest, thinking about the redistribution of wealth, for example,
Right.
because we're speaking of startups, quote unquote, that are worth almost $1 trillion. I mean,
It's
it's
not
a
a
sort of
startup.
surreal, well, that's what they call themselves because they're not yet publicly listed and so on, but it's actually an unprecedented scale of companies. We have companies like NVIDIA now touching $5 trillion of valuation, probably more or roughly the same as the GDP of Japan. So the power of these companies and their ability to invest now in the next wave of innovation, but also to influence policy making, to sponsor all kinds of events, to be represented in international debates, it's really extraordinary. And I'm a big believer that we have to always have countervailing powers where there's significant power, and we need to catch up. We need to catch up with the new reality that tech and AI are presenting us, and do so from a societal benefit point of view, and really look at what AI success actually looks like. Because right now we're in a situation where we hear extraordinary promises, that AI might solve the climate crisis, cure cancer, solve the energy scarcity problem, allow for scientific breakthroughs. Well, who doesn't want that? Sounds amazing. But in the meantime, there are significant sacrifices, and these externalities, the cost, the investment, also comes from society itself. It's not just, investors, venture capitalists that are putting money up, or AI companies spending their own money, but it's also our ability to earn a living in the future, our environment, our critical thinking. And I think from that point of view, businesses should also really care. Because I think there's a bit of a hype now of embracing AI, not missing the boat, the fear of missing out. But the more dependent companies get on AI platforms, generative AI platforms from different countries, the more the ability to earn money on top of those platforms will also benefit stakeholders elsewhere. So, we've already seen, for example, Anthropic offering a financial services package on top of its generative AI platform. Well, who will lose from that? Banks, of course, and companies that offer financial services. So I think even this hype of not wanting to miss out has to be critically assessed. Like, okay, we want to be more efficient, but efficiency is not the only goal in society. What will more efficiency lead to in the future, and what could be the downsides?
Which big tech company do you think is the most powerful right now?
I think NVIDIA is still very powerful, and of the AI platforms, I think they're all racing to stay on top. It's hard to say who's the most powerful. Some of them are more reckless than others. I think OpenAI is quite reckless. But who's the most powerful? It depends. There are also smaller powerful companies. I mean, in my book, I also describe the spyware sector, which is arguably not big tech, but it's very powerful, very invasive tech that allows for the stealthy exfiltration of information from people's devices. And so I don't think we should only look at size. We should also look at impact. And we need to have processes in place that create a rule of law, survival, democratic governance over any company, no matter whether we love or hate the CEO, or whether we think that they are sort of the better or the worst kind of company. I think there's a tendency to think, oh, well, we don't like this person, but we do like that person. Or, the politics of an Elon Musk are, dangerous, but, we've not heard from another CEO, so maybe they're not so aggressive. I don't think we should put our fate as society in the hands of a couple of CEOs. I think we should regain control as citizens, basically.
You wrote in your book that some American entrepreneurs criticize European tech regulations as emotional thing, as something that holds back innovation. But you also described the EU as a kind of a super regulator, trying to bring democratic rules back into the relationship with big tech. So why did the European Union feel it had to move so strongly on tech regulation? How this approach actually made big tech accountable?
So maybe the why first. I think a lot of Europeans in longer history, but also in recent history, have lived under the consequences of the abuse of power, including with help of technology. So I'm talking about communism and about Nazism, which is very recent for a lot of Europeans. When I served in the European Parliament, I would serve alongside people whose parents and grandparents had been in the gulags, who had been resistance fighters against the communism. So the idea that our democracy is sacred and that innovation, yes, it's very important, but it's not the only important thing in society, is very deeply felt by Europeans. And so if people want to call that emotional, I don't mind. I think it's actually really good to deeply care about core principles like fundamental rights and, for example, the right to privacy. So that explains why Europeans are allergic to too much power, either in the hand of government or in the hand of companies. And so from that perspective, to make sure that gatekeepers cannot prevent innovation, or to make sure that data is protected, or to make sure that AI is safe, or that cybersecurity is robust, there are a whole bunch of regulatory frameworks in Europe which led European leaders to consider themselves super regulators until roughly a year and a half ago, when they stopped this trend of embracing regulation as a source of pride, and now they're deregulating in Europe. And the idea is that regulation has gone too far, that it's hindered the competitiveness of European companies. And it comes at a time where there's also a lot of pressure from the US on European regulation. So I think it's a very delicate balance to strike between wanting to be more agile, less bureaucratic, and not giving in to pressure. Because, of course, digital sovereignty is also about sovereignty of regulation, of not being coerced to reduce regulation or to change regulation. So I'm quite critical of this so-called simplification effort in the EU, which is what this deregulatory effort is called. And I think whether we want more or less regulation is a bit of a distraction from the notion that we need to build alternatives. So we need to see more EU-made AI companies, offerings in the whole tech stack, because that makes, one, it creates more choice, which is important, I think, but also it makes Europeans less vulnerable to the way in which the Trump administration uses tech as an instrument of power. And by the way, the Chinese authorities do the same. But Europeans are much less dependent on Chinese technology than they are on American technology. So the impact of what happened in the US and what has changed in the US transatlantic relation over the past years is much more impactful for Europeans and presumably also for Japanese people. And so I think building should be the priority. We shouldn't even lose time over a big debate about more or less regulation. We should double down on making sure that European companies get more opportunity to grow, attract more talent, make it easier for people to come to Europe. It's an interesting reverse in trends, because for a long time more Europeans and tech talent from Europe would leave to go work in the US, but this is now reversed. So we see more Americans coming to Europe now to work in the tech. It's happening. We know the circumstances are difficult for people. There are people working in US companies that don't want to see the companies they work for being the foot soldiers of the Trump administration. Think about the role that Palantir plays in helping ICE, signal where undocumented immigrants are, or being very aggressive vis-a-vis demonstrators that are peacefully opposing these measures. So a lot of people in these companies have second thoughts about where their talent is actually going, what it's contributing to. We have people who are in the LGBTQI community who don't feel safe, all kinds of reasons why Americans are unhappy where they are, or where Europeans working in America, or Indian people working in America, Japanese people working in America are unhappy. And I think Europeans could do much more to bring in talent, including in tech.
But building a successful tech company is not easy, and it's not guaranteed those companies can be successful. So, yeah, how is that? How does that happen?
There is never a guarantee that a company can be successful, but in Europe we can do more to create circumstances that make it more attractive for scale-ups, especially, to stay in Europe. I think one of our biggest problems is that startups, when they want to grow and when they need investments, it's harder to find in Europe, even though Europe is very wealthy, but they go to the US for venture capital, essentially, more risk tolerant investments. And this is something we can solve in Europe. We will need regulation for it, so that's why it's also a bit stupid to say, regulation is always bad or regulation is always good, because regulation is a process that can lead to good and bad outcomes, and usually people don't agree about what good and bad is, and that's why we have a democratic society, so that we can debate and have a predictable process. So there's a lot that we can do, and it's not about picking winners or losers, but it's about creating circumstances that allow for European companies to grow, and to make sure, for example, also that the government leads by example by using more European tech companies in the national security interest, because we don't want our tech use to be a tool of geopolitical coercion.
Right. Before we move on to the final part, I want to touch upon one topic about so Palantir CEO Alex Karp published a book called The Technological Republic a while ago. It's released in Japan last month, and it's
I heard
been
that.
the bestseller.
This is probably the antidote, my book.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So, he argues that technology companies should play a much larger role in national defense and public mission. What do you think about the Alex Karp's arguments?
Well, what I think is contradictory about his book is that on the one hand he celebrates the West. And the values that he connects to the West are the ones that we have indeed known since World War II until, Trump sort of destroyed the West by the US attacking Europe, stepping away from the alliance, and having this zero-sum America first view instead.
Right.
And Alex Karp is now joining this America first perspective. His company is really helping the Trump administration in very tangible terms, for example, by helping ICE round up people or scanning large volumes of information about US citizens. But I think it's also an important signal. It's a choice he can make. He can align himself with the US president, but why would other governments trust this company to then be in the heart of their sensitive data and decision making, whether it's about triage in the case of medical issues, whether it's about national security and identifying targets for drone attacks? I think the gamble that a lot of companies, and Palantir is certainly one of them, are taking by tying their relations so closely to this US president, which, whether you love or hate him, he's controversial. So I think that these companies are taking a huge gamble. And we see this already. In the US, there are big protest movements growing against big tech, against data centers in communities, against the use of AI in the military, against Palantir directly. So we see now that action groups are asking of candidates for Congress to sell their stock in Palantir, to not take campaign donations. And so we're actually seeing that these companies are becoming political actors, but they're also being held account for their politics. And so, he's free to do what he wants. By reading the book, we know where he stands, and it's often really going very far. He also speaks about superiority of cultures and other cultures not being so superior. People have called it a fascist theory. So now we know where he stands, and that's good. It's helpful. But if you don't want to be a subject to America First policies, then you would choose other companies.
Do you think he stands for the country because that's the huge business opportunity or something? Or
it's a huge business opportunity for Palantir. He has benefited from supporting Trump and Trump supporting him. This can also turn. Trump is not very popular. There's a lot of protest movements in the United States. He will presumably go down with the same politics when it does go down. But I think it does stand for a new sort of set of corporate actors that also have very strong political and geopolitical agendas. Some of them are very anti-democratic, and some of them are certainly anti-European. And we have to draw the conclusions from that. So I think it only creates a stronger mission for Europeans to become more sovereign in their tech use and creation. And that's one of the consequences of the outsized power. And so, when I look at these protest movements and when I look at what is at stake for companies, I would not be surprised if more of them would move towards making the case for regulation, because regulation is actually a softer landing for them than having a confrontational set of public uprisings, demonstrations, boycotts and whatnot, that we already see happening. We see it in the US now. it's still fragmented, but it could well become a bigger movement.
Right.
And so I think for companies even, having regulation would not be such a bad outcome.
Right, okay. Now let me move to the final part, the AI in the future of Japan. So we should think about what Japan should do. Japan relies heavily on American technology companies, like all of them, like NVIDIA, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and all the Anthropic and OpenAI. So from the perspective of your book, what risks does this dependency create for Japan's democracy or sovereignty?
So I want to be modest in talking about Japan. While I am in Japan, I'm not an expert on Japan, but I think if we look at the dynamics and those dependencies that you just laid out, they're very similar to the situation Europe is in. And Europeans have long had a so-called special relationship with the US. I think Japanese people feel the same. You've had a special relationship with the US. The US is important for national security guarantees and so on. But the special relationship is fragile, and it is not a guarantee. So I think the dependency can become a vulnerability for Japanese society as well. And I hope it leads to discussions about tech sovereignty, about creating more choice and options and more grip from the perspective of what Japanese society needs.
Okay. And do you think Japan should keep building companies like you mentioned for the Europe case?
Well, I think it would benefit Japanese people to have a competitive economy and to continue to advance in tech innovations, high tech, of course, but also AI. And there are a lot of building blocks in Japan that are very, very powerful. The whole gaming industry and entertainment, but also just manufacturing and tying that to AI through physical AI. So I think that there are many areas. You have a very talented population, a wealthy population in terms of being innovators, wanting to use tech. I think there are a lot of building blocks that Japan could really make use of.
So you talked about regulations in Europe, and there's been some discussions around AI regulation in Japan too. So what do you think the most important lesson about the regulations from Europe for Japan?
So I think it's important to keep in mind that the path that AI takes in our society is not inevitable, that it's possible to intervene, to put up guardrails, to protect safety, to protect fairness in the economy, to protect people's rights. I think it's important to look at tech and AI through the lens of power. So I've seen the AI Basic Plan of Japan, which focuses on trustworthy AI, which I think makes a lot of sense, looking at how people view Japan as very diligent, high quality in terms of life, but also care, hospitality, etc. To see that as a through line into AI. But what we tend to see generally with AI policy, especially when it's more norms-based than rules-based, which I think the AI plan for Japan does now, is that it tends to cater a lot to economic needs, which is important, and less so to societal needs. And I'm making the case for a more society-wide definition of success. So not just looking at competitiveness and not just looking at what kind of AI to build, like trustworthy AI, which I think is a good goal. Safe and trustworthy is what we need. But then to also look more broadly. What does AI mean for national security? What does it mean for an aging population? What does it mean for future generations? I mean, the first figures of impact on employment show that recent grads have a more difficult time to get jobs. If this trend continues, then is it really success to have so much more efficiency? What kind of social programs do you need to make sure that there's redirection of these people into viable jobs for the future, or redistribution of wealth? But I think the bottom line for Japan is how much dependency on US tech will it tolerate, and what will it mean for a wider societal effect, not only today, but also in the near future.
Okay. Before I let you go, I have final questions. If you give the 3 recommendations to Japanese government about AI policy or regulation, what should they do?
Well, again, I feel very modest to be advising the Japanese government here. But I think that this societal-wide vision is important, that understanding the risks of dependency. And I know it's a delicate balance, but I think we've learned some painful, very painful lessons in Europe. And I would just hate for Japan to have to go through the same. And so the last thing I would say is that Japan has a lot to offer, not only in terms of its industry, its talent, and its society, but also as an actor on the international stage. So I think that one of the more interesting visions for democratic societies to work along is the middle powers vision that Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada offered in Davos. And we in Europe look to Japan as a like-minded ally. We feel very connected to Japan in terms of our values, our democracy. And so I hope that Japan will also be willing, aside from taking care of its own society and people, which it must, to also look at the changing geopolitical reality and to find new allies. And I hope that Europe is among them for the Japanese, but that we can together build larger coalitions of like-minded countries that will make the flow of goods and services easier amongst ourselves, but also our governance cooperation, because together we have a critical mass. And I think we need to think very deliberately about what not only the survival of democracy means in relation to tech in our own societies, but also globally, and that it prompts us to work together much more closely than we already do.
Okay. Great to hear all of that. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Let me do the outro in Japanese quick. というわけでここまでマリエッチェ・スハーケさんと共に AI は誰のものかというテーマでお送りしてまいりました。本日もご視聴いただきありがとうございます。ぜひチャンネル登録と高評価、そしてクロスディック公式 X のフォロー、さらにニュースレターの配信も始めております。ぜひ概要欄からのご登録もお願いいたします。というわけでスハーケさんをお迎えしました。Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.